Welcome to Off to Battle's Army Composition and Survival Primer. When looking over a faction's roster, often I'll dive in and work out the details as I go, knowing it will be a violent and brutal learning process, but an effective one over the long haul. What I'm looking for comes down to four main categories. Where is my speed? Where is my armor piercing? Where is my anti-large? Where is my armor? If you think about it, very little in the game fills all four of these without some kind of designed weakness, and even with such a weakness, you still have something worth multiples its weight in gold. Whether it's efficient is an issue of the cost you have to pay for all of that, but it will undoubtedly be effective. The vast majority of offerings in this game will be only part of this list, and the weakest will invariably provide none. This is why the core of my unit-focused video series is the Humble Empire Swordsman, listed with 120 entities, middling HP, 30 armor, basic shields, melee attack 32, and melee defense 32, and melee defense 32, and melee defense 32, and melee defense 32. This is a unit that is great at nothing, decent at many things, and relatively cheap, but not insanely so. There are people I respect, who will never ever willingly recruit a swordsman unit. Despite this, it is an excellent source of comparison. Let's take Empire Halberdiers and Empire Greatswords. The former is an anti-large and anti-armor unit, but is not fast, and that is particularly acute in terms of attack interval. It just attacks slowly. It also isn't armored very well. Without shields, it stands to be shredded by weak, high rate of fire, high base damage, low armor piercing, and hence weak, archers in the game such as Ungor Raiders. Yet despite its weaknesses, it is hideously difficult for vastly more expensive, qualitatively superior cavalry units to defeat, or in the course of defeating it, without suffering filthy levels of damage the attacking general doesn't want to accept. He might have to, but it is not a happy process. Greatswords are both armored and anti-armor, but in foot speed, are even slower than halberdiers, and are emphatically not anti-large, though they'll at least batter low-tier knights in pitched combat. Their fat anti-infantry bonus is nice, and certainly desirable, but it's not special enough to get this into the top tier when we're identifying a faction's strengths and weaknesses. So logically you could equip an army with great swords and halberdiers. Well, if you've been around a while and played the first Total War Warhammer, you know what happens when you actually do that. You have an interesting army against a bunch of enemy assets, but the more basic the enemy force, the more inefficient your expensive force becomes. Greatswords are there to fight armored infantry that Empire Swordsmen can't. Halberdiers are there to fight any kind of cavalry that Empire Swordsmen can't, or at least not fight well, along with monstrous infantry and so on. Neither has shields, so a single unit type can shred both, given time and opportunity, and that unit is Empire Crossbowmen. Well, guns will do it even better to some extent, but the halberdiers are just plain vulnerable to this. If crypt horrors clog the greatswords, and chaff infantry clog the halberdiers, their defense might protect them, but they'll drown on offense. It'll become a stalemate, and if that's the enemy's goal, that's a tactical defeat for you. What about a whole bunch of Ungor Raiders? What do you do about that? Even the greatswords will one-sidedly lose HP if they just sit and get shot at, and they're way too slow to catch the Ungors. What do? Wait for the Ungors to use up all of their ammunition and hope that they targeted the greatswords, not the halberdiers, and there's nothing else to worry about? That's why, to really deal with the problem, the Empire needs speed and armor. And anything from Empire Knights on up can deal with that. A single unit could roll up 3 or 4 Ungor Raiders given time, and operates with more or less complete impunity. 2 units of Knights could charge their way into 6 to 8 units of Ungor Raiders and eventually break them all. In other words, 4 greatswords and 4 halberdiers have a really hard time operating unless there are 2 knight units, and because they are killy anvils against different targets, the knights can cycle charge into the backs of engaged opponents, which is good for, winning. This is why, in my army parlance, Empire Knights are a force multiplier. The term multiplier is used to represent that it is more value than simply adding 2 more greatswords or 2 more halberdiers. It makes those units better. However, force multiplier units tend to do a poor job operating 100% on their own, running into every counter created for them over the centuries. What else is missing? Ranged, but ranged armor piercing is better insurance. Let's add 4 crossbowmen. The Lord is mandatory no matter what kind, so that is 15 slots taken. How about 2 mortars to keep the enemy honest, and an Empire Captain, a Bright Wizard, and a Witch Hunter. We've just created an immensely viable early game army. Some of the details may change. How about a Warrior Priest instead of a Witch Hunter? Wins aren't wasted, you have options at numerous ranges, you have an option against mass enemy missile infantry beyond the friendly range, and you have center of line and flanks covered decently. But if you could not acquire Empire Knights, there will be cases when it is simply better to spam Empire Swordsmen, Empire Spearmen with shields, and even basic archers as offsets. You are adding 35% missile block to more and more of the force, you aren't overcommitting in cost, and your wizard and mortars might still pull it out, at least in this instance. This is how you approach covering the bases. There are many ways to play, even just Empire. But if you have some degree of anti-large available, and if you can't spam speed, you use lots of range to compensate. And then you might be able to win a whole bunch of battles. Unlike the Halberdier and Greatsword army, you might struggle a lot with certain types of armored foes, but you also might be able to stop them long enough for lords, heroes, magic, fatigue, attrition, and crossbows to deal with. But let me tell you, just having the 2 Empire Knights is a real godsend. Of course your options will get a lot better later on, but the basics need to be respected, at least until you fight enemy Franken armies and need to do some very special things. That's fine, that's fair. That's Total War Warhammer in a far better state than it was a relatively short time ago. It's just to say, this is the starting point for comparing units. Great swords are not worthless, and you don't want to use halberdiers to do their job. You really don't. But they can try. And greatswords trying to do a halberdier's job against halberdier opponents are going to suffer badly. It's the combination of the two that's far stronger than each individually. And then you get 250 to 300 kills for the greatsword unit, and monstrous infantry ripped apart by halberdiers, and you win, and it doesn't even feel close. I hope this helps illustrate the approach I take as a starting point, and the approach I'll try to take looking at factions. Yes, I dive into things blind, I dabble, I make mistakes, but I'm trying to use it to build systematic knowledge so that I can recruit units with a purpose. And hopefully you can too. Take care, and have fun being the wily coyote, building entire armies to foil pesky birds, some of which burst into fire.